Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. There is no world in which A Hard Day's Night should have worked. Pop music and film had been blended together plenty of times, and frankly, to embarrassing results. It was a gimmick, nothing but a cash grab. These films were made for dirt cheap, and almost always topped off with a poorly written single recorded specifically for the film, so as to garner some profit from soundtrack sales. To sum it all up, it was a safe way to further capitalize off a fervid fanbase before the whole craze blew over. So as Beatlemania swept the UK during the summer of 1963, band manager Brian Epstein decided that he too wanted to capitalize. He began sending the word out in search of a production company, and just a few months later, he would find just that.
I get a call from Mike Stewart, and he said, I got a call from London from Noel Rogers, who runs our publishing company in London, and there's this rock group called the Beatles, and they are interested in making some rock and roll movies.
The man who approved the deal, David Picker, had not yet even heard of the Beatles. To be fair, neither had most of America at that point. David figured the films would do well enough in the UK, and at the very worst, still be a safe investment. When the Beatles signed on, it was simply another unremarkable deal. But that would change very quickly. On February 1st, 1964, the Beatles single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, reached #1 in the US, and by the time the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th, they had not just broken through to the American market, they were the most popular band in the entire country. David Picker and the whole of United Artists were clapping their knees. They had not only secured the Beatles, they had done so for dirt cheap. Time to make some money. Still, no one expected anything more than a quick buck. The film was allocated a small budget, and the Beatles were instructed by Brian Epstein not just to write a single for the film, but basically the entire soundtrack. Oh, and they had to do so while touring and performing nearly every night. Surely this doesn't end well, right? Well, I guess it is the Beatles after all. This is the story of A Hard Day's Night, the film, the music, and everything, yes, everything in between. Before we begin, I'd like to say that a good bulk of the material recorded for A Hard Day's Night, the album, was done so before filming began. So if you'd like to hear about that in detail, I suggest clicking the link in the top right to view the previous video. With that out of the way, it's time for just a little bit of backstory. But first, a word from our sponsor. Squarespace is an all-in-one website platform. Whatever your goals may be, Squarespace can help you accomplish them. From the jump, I was impressed by their design tools. We're talking templates, color palettes, visual design effects, all of which make it incredibly easy to create a stylish website in just a few clicks. And if you're like me and want to continue to make it your own, you can do just that with flexible drag and drop editing, custom pictures, and just about everything else you could want. If you're running a business, Squarespace allows you to address whatever needs you may have, such as their Acuity scheduling software, which makes booking and managing appointments stress-free. Looking to sell content? Whether it's classes, blogs, videos, or memberships, Squarespace allows you to paywall your work, set fees or subscription prices, and forget all the rest. Head to squarespace.com/makingofthebeatles for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, use offer code MAKINGOFTHEBEATLES to save 10% off your first purchase of website or domain. Back to the video. In January of 1964, a movie director named Richard Lester met with the Beatles at the BBC Theatre in Whitehall. The pair already had a very mild acquaintance, and the Beatles were fans of his short work with the Goons. Along with this, Richard Lester's one and only feature film, It's Trad, Dad, was a pop musical. Suffice to say, it was a good match. The seeds of A Hard Day's Night were planted in Paris. Screenwriter Alan Owen, in what would end up serving as a sort of pre-production for the film, tagged along with the Beatles during their 18-day residency at the Olympia Theatre. Lucky for Owen, they all stayed in the luxurious Georges V Hotel, and it was there that he would simply observe the Beatles, their personalities, quirks, and dynamics. And really, they made Owen's job easy. They bounced off each other with ease. And despite being so closely enmeshed, each Beatle had their own distinct character. All Owen did was distill their traits, throw in a little comic caricature, and his job was basically complete. But he deserves credit for placing them in the correct scene and setting. That is, the one they already occupied, the world of Beatlemania. They were only being asked to be themselves, and they were being deliberately put into circumstances that were recognizable, like a press conference, or a rehearsal, or a sound check. Getting into cars and trains, and being ordered about by road managers, and being shouted at. They knew how to do that. We didn't want them to be the Musketeers. We wanted them to be themselves. The idea of a fictionalized documentary became self-evident very early on. Basically, A Hard Day's Night walked so that This Is Spinal Tap could run. And not only did this approach help the Beatles appear natural, but it also lent itself to a very specific style of filmmaking that allowed them to shoot very quickly and very cheaply. It could not have come together any more perfectly. On March 2nd, 1964, filming would begin. And it was on this very first day of shooting that George Harrison would meet his future wife, model Pattie Boyd, who would later describe their meeting. George, with velvet brown eyes and dark chestnut hair, was the best looking man I'd ever seen. At the break for lunch, I found myself sitting next to him. Whether by accident or design, I have never been sure. As the train neared London and the filming was winding down, I felt sad that such a magical day was ending. As if George had known what I was thinking, he said, "Will you marry me?" I laughed, as I had at all the Beatles jokes. I scarcely allowed myself to wonder why he had said it. Then he said, "Well, if you won't marry me, will you have dinner with me tonight?" I was thrown. Was he serious or just playing around? I felt awkward and said I couldn't. I had a boyfriend, but I was sure my boyfriend would love to meet him. Maybe we could all go out. George didn't think so, so we said our farewells at the station and disappeared into the night. The day's shooting would close with a scene straight out of the movie itself.
They had been dropped off in a field outside of London. The train came back into the Marylebone station, and out of nowhere, again, children were starting to run towards the train. At that point, our clapper loader, who was about 24 years old with the same sort of hairdo, came smiling down, having finished the first day's work with all the negative, and the screaming started. And he panicked, and he thought, I've got to outrun them. And he started to run, and he was carrying 8 or 9 tins of film, and they caught up with him. And the film got dropped, and we lost half the first day's shooting negative. It was lying around under the tracks, and he ran for his life.
One thing I really love about this film is its absurdist elements, such as the scene shot on this day, where the Beatles magically appear on the outside of the train. And scenes such as this are not just deployed for the sake of silliness.
The sense that there was a slightly surreal element to the film was something that was very important to try to get in. And I wanted to prepare the audience for the fact that they would be playing cards, for example, in a part of the train, and then suddenly in the middle of it they would be playing instruments, and then they would be back playing cards, because that did seem to be something that nobody had been doing. So we used 2 or 3 little signposts, like the boys suddenly being outside the train, banging on the window, trying to get in, just to say to the audience, things are not quite what they seem to be.
Let's now step away from the film for a moment to indulge in a fun bit of Beatles lore you may not know. That being a studio session that had remained a secret until its discovery in 1991 during the production of the anthology series. Can't Buy Me Love was slated as the Beatles' next single, and time was running out to have the mix completed. But there was one small technical problem. The tape containing Ringo's drum track had a ripple in it, which had the effect of dulling the treble on his hi-hat. The exact opposite of what you want for that element of the percussion. So engineer Norman Smith left the control room and sat down at the drums in the studio. He hastily recorded a few bars of hi-hats to layer on top of Ringo's, and that was it. So technically, Ringo was not the only drummer on Can't Buy Me Love. On March 11th, the Beatles would begin filming inside the infamous Twickenham Studios, the space they'd eventually occupy for a number of promotional films, and of course, the Let It Be documentary. To be filmed on this day was the Beatles' performance of I Should Have Known Better, which despite taking place in a train car, was filmed in the studio rather than an actual train. But to accomplish the look of a rattling car, the set was jostled back and forth by the crew, though at one point they had to stop shooting, due to the fact that the crew unconsciously began rocking to the rhythm of the music. The next day, George and Pattie would again collide. She would say, There was a press photo call at Twickenham Studios, and each of us schoolgirls had to stand behind a Beatle and pretend to do their hair. I made a beeline for George. He seemed pleased to see me and asked how my boyfriend was. I told him I dumped him. He grinned and asked to have dinner with me. Just like that, the two became a couple. The dialogue throughout the film almost appears to be ad-libbed, and seems perfectly in character for the boys.
No, actually, we're just good friends.
What would you call that hairstyle you're wearing?
Arthur.
This is not the case, however. The dialogue was meticulously written to sound as natural as possible, highly influenced by the boys' natural Liverpudlian cadence, though toned down quite a bit, so that a general audience could have a clue what they were saying.
Yeah, I think it did, because, as I say, Alan hung around with us and was careful to try and put words into our mouths that he might have heard us speak or that he thought. So I think he did a very good script.
What is very much ad-lib, though, is the physicality. A perfect example, of course, being the scene shot today, on March 13th, wherein the Beatles simply run and jump about a helipad. There was no direction beyond, hey, go be silly. The result was one of the more memorable sequences of the film, carried alone by the Beatles' music and personality.
I was able to allow people the freedom to move, to go where they want as far as possible. No mark should be given to anybody. No one should have to hit a mark or sit to the center of their chairs. It was just, you do what you want to do, we'll go out in the field and have a play, and then we would find a way to turn it into a little sequence.
Time and time again, the limited schedule and lack of budgetary flexibility resulted in what were essentially bloopers. Bloopers that were left in the film, and only served to enhance its charm, its feeling of bizarre realism.
We just shot the picture the way we went. And whenever something came up, it was in the picture. When George knocked his amp over on one of the shows, in the picture. But that's what it was about.
On March 20th, the Beatles would appear on the program, Ready, Steady, Go.
Well, each week we like to have a special look at fashion, so we'll kick off that way this week. First of all, hairstyles. They are long as always. And boots, well, the high heels, the Cuban heels are still there. And of course our four models are none other than the Beatles!
Look, I know these interviews and appearances aren't the most narrative, compelling things in the world, but I can't help but share a few clips.
I might add, I phoned the States just half an hour ago, and they tell me that this week it's 1, 2, 3, and 4 are your records. And what's more, you've got another 6 in the top 100, making 10 in altogether. Very nice. So all I suggest is that don't keep on with this, otherwise there'll be a second war of independence. Watch it, blokes. Kathy. Now, our amateur disc jockey this week is John Lennon. But just before we talk about disc jockeying and records that you like, John, what about books?
What about them?
Well, you've just written one, haven't you?
Well, I just so happens to have. It's at 9 and 6, Keith, and it'll be out on Tuesday or Wednesday.
Yeah, but tell us what's in it, then we might feel like buying it.
Rubbish.
Yeah, but what is it? Poetry, or prose, or what?
But it's a sort of words and things with drawings.
Well, when we said you'd just written it, have you in fact just done it? Did you do it a long time ago?
It's been a long time. Long time.
How long?
About 40 years or so, I think.
Come off it. How long ago did you write
It's a couple of years, you know. Some of it's old, some of it's new, something borrowed, something brown.
Time to jump ahead a little bit. The climatic sequence of the film, wherein the Beatles performed to an audience, was filmed on March 31st. There's a couple of fun facts to touch on here. First off, and most well known, is that among the crowd was a 13-year-old Phil Collins, who before becoming a famous musician was a child actor, and the whole crowd was made up of actors who, either out of immense commitment or legitimate Beatlemania, screamed their heads off during the entire ordeal, just as they would have at an actual Beatles concert. Great for the film, but not so great for the cameraman, who was stationed among the crowd.
One of the other camera operators, it might be interesting to know, was in amongst the girls in the crowd, and at the end of 4 days shooting had to be taken in an emergency car to his dentist because all his back teeth had come loose from the intensity of the sound.
It was driving me mad. I took a bottle of aspirin almost because, still got to carry on shooting. And I went to the dentist and he said, "There's nothing wrong with the tooth." And I said, "Well, there is." I said, "Because it's aching." I said, "Take it out." He reckoned that it was to do with vibration and frequency, something to do with the amalgam vibrating inside your mouth. It was absolute agony. I mean, it really was.
But what occurred the next day is far, far more important. It was, somewhat fittingly, on April 1st, that for the first time in 17 years, John Lennon came face to face with his father, Alfred Lennon. Alfred had not been separated from John by some unfortunate accident or by some uncontrollable circumstance. He had, simply put, abandoned him. The last time the two had contact was in July of 1946, when Alf, returning from sea after going AWOL in the United States, essentially kidnapped John, planning to immigrate with him to New Zealand. John was tracked down by his mother Julia, and after some discussion, it was decided that John remain with her. Alf didn't have to be told twice. From that point on, he made no attempt to reach John, even when Julia was struck dead by an automobile in 1958. So it was not familial love that brought Alf back to John. Alf was near destitute, while John was rich and one of the most famous men on the planet. I think we all know what brought Alf crawling back. It all began when Alf, accompanied by a journalist, arrived at Nim's offices. The presence of a journalist makes it clear that Alf's immediate intent was to produce publicity, a story of a long-lost father returning. Brian Epstein was contacted and informed that a man claiming to be John Lennon's father was in the office. Brian immediately flew into a panic, himself very aware of John's feelings toward his father. He sent a car for John, and John cautiously agreed to come by. On his arrival, Alf stuck his hand out to John, who ignored it, simply saying, "What do you want?" "Money, of course." Alf attempted to appeal to John, saying, "You can't turn your back on your family, no matter what they've done." John didn't fall for it. After just 20 minutes, he had Alf dismissed. Seeing as a journalist was present, Brian Epstein had to negotiate in order to keep this very personal interaction from hitting the press. Brian offered a number of exclusive stories to the journalist, who agreed to the terms. On April 5th, the Beatles filmed the iconic opening of the film, a wonderfully dramatized version of a situation not at all alien to the band. My favorite part, of course, is George absolutely eating shit. Comedy gold. Time to throw a little bit of context into this fairly banal recapping of the production of the film. For the first time in years, the Beatles have taken an extended break from touring. In many ways, it's almost a vacation. Would a normal human being consider shooting for hours, nearly every day, a vacation? Definitely not. But for the Beatles, it meant that they now had the nights to themselves, to do as they pleased, unlike when they were touring, and all their debauchery had to be confined to the walls of hotel rooms. Were the Beatles incredibly hard workers? Yes, but they were also not the most responsible bunch. Dick Lester would say, "There were times when somebody had been out all night and was coming in not at his best, and there are some scenes in the film where I am wearing Beatles shoes and I'm operating the camera and I'm panning from my feet to the other three because one of the four was missing." So comes April 9th, the day on which the iconic Ringo Alone sequence was filmed.
Getting up early in the morning wasn't the best thing we could do. And especially, the scene in Hard Day's Night where the one I actually got really good credit for was the walking on the beach, by the canal with the camera and that, like the lonely guy scene. That came about because, I came directly to work very unprofessional, straight from a nightclub. And I was a little hungover, to say the least. I was just so out of it. So we said, well, let's do anything. And my version of it, I said, well, just let me walk around and film me. And why I look so cold and dejected is because I felt like shit. So nothing, no acting going on there. It just felt so bad.
It finally came time for the Beatles to do exactly what I derided in our intro. Write a single, specifically for the film. It had to be energetic, something to jumpstart the film and roll in the closing credits on a celebratory note. The title had already been decided, A Hard Day's Night. There's your prompt, boys. So the song was not a work of inspiration, nor passion. It was simply a job. And just like most of the pop film singles before it, it would be a shallow, forgettable novelty. Except, this is the Beatles, and everything they touched turned to gold. Let's start off with the title, A Hard Day's Night. Sure, it was assigned to them, but the source of the phrase was the Beatles themselves, specifically Ringo. Ringo had a penchant for malaprops, or as the boys like to call them, Ringoisms. and the Beatles were already familiar with A Hard Day's Night in particular. In fact, John used the phrase in his book. But it was Dick Lester who ultimately recommended the phrase as the title for the film. The track was primarily written by John, with Paul helping to polish it off. It was essentially written in a day, and on April 16th, time was booked at EMI Studios to record the song. Journalist Maureen Cleave, who was present for the sessions, remarked the following. The song seemed to materialize as if by magic. It consisted of John humming to the others. Then they would all put their heads together and hum. And 3 hours later, they had this record. Cleave also contributed a small piece to the song. In his original draft, John wrote the following. But when I get home to you, I find my tiredness is through, and I feel all right. Cleave rightfully told him that she thought it was a weak line. So John immediately took out a pen, crossed out the line, and came up with, When I get home to you, I find the things that you do. Considering the haste in which the song was conceived, the Beatles had just a little trouble during recording. Paul, surprisingly, struggled with the bass during the middle 8. The song has a simple sounding, but surprisingly difficult guitar solo, almost wholly due to the speed at which it is played. George struggled to play it live with the rhythm recording, so it was decided they overdub it later. And when they did, they relied on a bit of studio trickery to get it just right. First off, the guitar solo is doubled on the piano, played of course by George Martin. Secondly, the tape was rolled at half speed during recording, meaning they played the solos half as fast as they actually appear on the final version. Finally, because there was only one available track on which to overdub, George Harrison and George Martin had to play and record their parts at the same time. Here's something that may surprise some people. Dick Lester was present for the session and actually had a significant influence on the final arrangement of the song. This was completely out of the ordinary for the Beatles. Even at this stage, no one besides George Martin had ever provided more than a crumb of suggestion or feedback. But according to engineer Jeff Emmerich, it was Lester who, quote, kept insisting that something blockbuster was needed for the opening of the film, and Martin would say, we needed something striking, to be a sudden jerk into the song. It was by chance that John struck the right one. We knew it when we heard it. Which brings us to the following. Just how did the Beatles make the sound that rings in the song? For years and years, nobody knew. Plenty of people got close, very close, but no one could seem to get it just right. But thanks to modern access to the original recording tracks, the mystery has been solved. From here, I will be referencing this video by Randy Bachman.
Okay, the most famous chord ever on a 12-string guitar. This is the one chord that everyone around the world knows. Now, Denise and I were in London last year. A wonderful thing happened. I got an email from Giles Martin, who's George Martin's son. Giles Martin invites us into the studio, so we go to Abbey Road Studio, and it's like the suite. No one else can get in there. He says to us, I have all the Beatles source tapes. They've all been put in here. In a computer, in Pro Tools. What do you want to hear? I think about it for a while and I say, well, there's been a lot of argument and speculation, and I know guys have written little books on it. The first chord of Hard Day's Night. What is the first chord? He said, okay, I'll let you hear it. So he put up one track at a time, because when you hear it all at once, it's like bang, it's like the greatest thing to hear all at once. I heard the first chord. It was George on a 12-string just like this, and it's an F chord, but you put a G on top, and you put a G on the bottom, and you put a C next to that G. Now, I said, put on Paul's bass. What note was Paul playing? D. Paul's playing a D on the bass, and John's rhythm guitar was a D chord with a sus4, which means it got a G note on it. So now listen to this. We only did this yesterday, and it just blew me away. 1, 2, 3, 4. Isn't that fantastic? Woo!
Remember how Norman Smith technically drummed on Can't Buy Me Love? Well, he would again make an appearance here, as Ringo struggled immensely with the rhythm of the bongos. Eventually, he told Ringo to forget it, and Norman's bongo playing was later overdubbed. we'll cap off with the song's outro, which again was influenced by Lester. Emmerich said, Lester kept insisting that he needed a, quote, dreamy fade-out in order to segue into the movie's first scene. And the Beatles delivered just that.
You know I feel alright.
How about a quick moment to humanize the ever-polarizing figure of John Lennon? We all know John was a piece of work, that his ego was enormous, but we also know that he was incredibly insecure. On April 23rd, John would attend a literary luncheon held solely in his honor to celebrate his recently published In His Own Right. John's obviously no stranger to these sorts of things, but they'd always been centered around the Beatles, not on a work of his own. He wasn't sure what to expect, and really didn't expect all that much. He and his wife Cynthia arrived hungover and nervous. Neither had realized that the media would be there in force. John was surrounded by journalists and TV cameras. As the two made their way to their seats, John was informed that he was expected to make a speech. He had not prepared for that. John was introduced and stood up before the audience. He was, according to Cynthia, more terrified than I'd ever seen him.
Thank you all very much, sir. God bless you. You've got a lucky face.
To the guest and the media, John's quote-unquote speech appeared to be a typical Lennon gesture, a defiant snub to the establishment. This time, though, it was anything but. He had panicked, and according to Cynthia, felt terribly embarrassed afterward. April 24th would mark the final day of filming for A Hard Day's Night. The scene shot today was another segment of the wonderful Lonely Ringo sequence, a brilliant gag in which Ringo, ever the gentleman, lays his coat over a puddle for a passing woman.
Gotcha, you nasty little person, you. Come on. Oh, yeah.
And with that, the Beatles completed their first ever feature film. But Brian Epstein liked to keep the boys busy, and rarely said no to any proposition. So just 4 days after completing filming, the Beatles would make a surreal television appearance on an hour-long program titled Around the Beatles. Just what did this appearance entail? There was of course a mimed performance, but by far, the most memorable part was their comedic reenactment of Shakespeare's A Midsummer's Night Dream.
Not a word. Don't call that. Yeah, not a word. Not a word. Come, trusty sword. Come, blade. My breast improved.
Following this, the Beatles would play a couple of shows in Scotland, and then finally, for real this time, have a vacation. Here's something I think is sweet. In their early days, the Beatles would almost always vacation alongside each other. There is one glaring exception, but for the most part, they'd split off into pairs, depending on who was inclined to go where, and spend some quality time together. On May 2nd, John, Cynthia, George, and his brand new love, Pattie Boyd, all flew to Hawaii before making it to Tahiti, while Paul, Jane, Ringo, and Maureen first flew to Paris, then Lisbon, and finally, the Virgin Islands. Considering the Beatles' fame, arranging a private, relaxing vacation was no easy feat, and somewhat resembled something out of a spy movie. Each of the Beatles and their partners were assigned code names, as well as disguises. This convoluted plan resulted in a mix-up, as recalled by Ringo. The funny part was that we'd been given John and George's passports, and they'd been given ours. Somehow we got to Lisbon and were checking into a hotel. Paul was wearing a disguise, and the guy at reception said, "Who's that?" Looking at the passport suspiciously, "That's not you." Thus begins the vacation recap portion of the video, guaranteed to entertain only the most deranged of Beatles fans. First off, these trips lasted nearly 4 weeks, which in Beatle terms is almost a disturbingly long time to have to relax. Let's start with the Virgin Islands. We had a 30-foot motorboat that we'd rented, Ringo would say. It was nothing palatial, but we cruised around having a great time. Jane couldn't go in the sun and Paul got sunburnt one day and was screaming all night. Our bedrooms were either side of the passageway, with only curtains dividing them, so you could hear everything. I know he's referring to the screaming, but I don't think that's the only thing he's referring to. Paul could not and had no desire to escape music. On his arrival, he immediately purchased a cheap guitar. The end result of this decision was perhaps one of the greatest songs Paul ever wrote. I remember writing Things We Said Today in one of the cabins below deck one afternoon. I got away from the main party, but it was a bit queasy downstairs. You could smell the oil, and the boat was rocking a bit, and I'm not the best sailor in the world, so I wrote a little bit of it downstairs, and then the rest of it on the back deck, where you couldn't smell the engine. It was a slightly nostalgic thing already, a future nostalgia. We'll remember the things we said today, sometime in the future. So the song projects itself into the future, and then is nostalgic about the moment we're living in now, which is quite a good trick. Which, agreed Paul, the song is spectacular. It's rare for a song to be rich both in prosperous romance and legitimate melancholy. This is embellished further by the unique chord progressions utilized throughout. It's moody, wistful, and beautiful. Now let's check in on Group Tahiti. Just like the others, they rented a boat and embarked out to sea. George Harrison provides a wonderful bit of storytelling. We slept on a boat that night and started sailing first thing in the morning. But as soon as we were out of the harbor, we got into a really rough channel of water. We had to keep the engine going, and the boat had just been painted, so it stunk of diesel and paint. We couldn't go below deck because of the fumes, so we lay on holding to the deck. Soon Cynthia and I were feeling sick and puked everywhere. The day seemed long, but eventually, as the sun was setting, we anchored at the next island. We were so ill that we just got into our bunks and went to sleep. The next morning I woke and looked out of the porthole. It was fantastic. A smooth lagoon with an island in the background, with mountains and coconut palms. 5 or 6 Tahitians were paddling on an outrigger canoe, gliding across the calm sea. It blissed me out. Cynthia and Patty had long black wigs, which they wore as disguises. John and I put their wigs on and our oilskin Macs and made a little 8mm film about natives on an island with a missionary, John, who comes out of the ocean to convert them. Now maybe that last bit doesn't age spectacularly, but it did produce a spectacular picture. I didn't even recognize John at first. Eventually though, all good things come to an end. Well, maybe not so good, if you're John at least. The sun's there if you want to go out and get it. I don't give a damn about the sun. You go out to these places and waste your time lying on a beach. I did it with George for 3 weeks. We were brown as berries, and we got home and it had gone the next day. So what's the point? I didn't feel any healthier. I was dead beat. By May 27th, all 4 Beatles and their partners were home. By the time June arrived, it was time to return to the studio. Work began with Matchbox, a Carl Perkins cover. It had long been a part of the Beatles' early live repertoire, and in fact, Pete Best used to take up lead vocal for the track. That would not be the case today, as Ringo took on the role. Up next was John's I'll Cry Instead, a lovely country-influenced ditty, one that was initially imagined for the Can't Buy Me Love sequence of A Hard Day's Night. After a quick break came another cover, this time Larry Williams' Slow Down. Then finally, the haunting ballad that would close A Hard Day's Night, John's I'll Be Back. The song would prove one of the more challenging for the Beatles to date. The first roadblock was the arrangement itself, as demonstrated on take 2, wherein the song is played in a 3/4 waltz.
You know, if you break my heart, I'll go.
This approach was quickly abandoned, as John found it too difficult to sing.
It's too hard to sing.
If you try to sing along to it like I did, you will find that rhythmically, it's pretty awkward. Then there were the haunting harmonies that accent the track, which took some time to get just right.
If you break my heart, I'll go, but I'll be back again.
Apparently, the ghost of the very much still alive Pete Best would come to haunt Ringo following his vocal theft of Matchbox, as the very next day, on June 2nd, Ringo would begin to feel a tickle in his throat. But not enough to halt today's work. They began with Any Time at All. It was a bit of a last-minute addition, and John did not have lyrics for the middle 8 of the song. Paul suggested that they throw in some piano and get to the lyrics later, but they never did so. Paul's Things We Said Today proved incredibly easy to record. Take 1 was a flub, but take 2 essentially completed the song, with just a few overdubs added on take 3. Finally came John's When I Get Home. They knocked it out in 11 takes. With that, they just about finished A Hard Day's Night, the LP. All they had to do was come in the next day, record a few overdubs, and then buckle back up, as the day after that, they'd be leaving for Denmark to once again begin touring. And not just any tour, the Beatles' first ever world tour. There was one small problem though. Overnight, the tickle in Ringo's throat had gotten worse. Much worse. But he had a photo shoot scheduled in the morning with Saturday Evening Post, so he dragged himself up out of bed and dutifully made his way there. And it was during this photo shoot that Ringo would collapse and be taken to the hospital the day before the Beatles' first ever world tour. That story next time on The Making of the Beatles. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, and if you would like to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing. These videos are released every 2 weeks, but do you want to watch the next video right now? You can do so by joining my Patreon for only $1 a month. Once again, thank you so much. Until next time.